Hello, my name is Jonathan Krezel. I am the lead for Space Shuttle Transition and Retirement in the Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate at NASA headquarters. My role in Space Shuttle Transition and Retirement was to serve as the primary point of contact at headquarters for programmatic retirement issues. So in that capacity, I was in the Space Operations Mission Directorate, later the Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate when it merged with the Exploration Systems Mission Directorate. I came into that position in 2010. My predecessor was Joel Kearns. Prior to that time, I had been working in the Space Shuttle office, focusing probably 50-50 between shuttle retirement issues and the normal shuttle operations issues that our office was responsible for taking care of. I came on board in a more full-time fashion as the initial planning stage had kind of settled out, the oscillations had been dampened, and we were in the tail end of operations, and we really started the execution phase of Shuttle TNR. And then that got kicked into really high gear when Joel left in 2010. Our last operational flight was in July 2011. So I was at the very tail end of that initial planning, and then when TNR hit after the last flight, STS-135, we were ready to hit the ground running. And that's where we are now. We just held our final Space Shuttle program meeting last week. And as of April 1st, 2013, the Space Shuttle office is effectively disbanded, and the issues will now be worked part-time. So I had the opportunity to see it from the early phases, early planning, all the way to final execution. I want to talk a little bit about the planning that was involved in transitioning from the early planning phase, starting up these organizations that would eventually execute shuttle retirement, setting up the interface organizations between operations and exploration at headquarters, until we got to the point of actual execution. One of the defining characteristics of the headquarters organization, which helped drive a lot of the shuttle retirement dynamic, was the fact that there were two separate mission directorates involved. There was a Space Operations Mission Directorate, which operated the shuttle. Then there was the Exploration Systems Mission Directorate, whose primary responsibility was to bring the new replacement systems online, what eventually became termed Constellation. And so you immediately separated, you bifurcated the decision-making process a bit. You had the shuttle program, who had a great deal of incentive to keep as many capabilities as they could online for as long as they could, because their primary duty was to safely fly out the program. And to do that, you needed facilities, property, workforce expertise. And I think if the operations folks had their way, they'd maintain absolutely everything until the end. And there was some wisdom to that, as we saw, particularly for STS-134. At the same time, when the program decided they didn't need something, there was an incentive to get rid of it to try to start buying down the costs. And not to, as a third example, not to disrupt operations all that much, to not insert any newness into the planning, because anything new in the program was something that might introduce uncertainty and might affect operations. On the exploration side, however, they were driven by a different dynamic. They were driven by the fact that they were just starting up. They wanted to keep their options open. They weren't starting with a blank sheet of paper, but they didn't want to be locked down until they absolutely had to be on what assets and capabilities and workforce they needed. So on the one hand, they were very reticent to pick up capabilities that the shuttle program had decided they no longer need. So there was sometimes a disconnect between when shuttle was ready to release something and when exploration wanted to pick it up. That was one dynamic. Another was just the opposite. Exploration wanted something that the shuttle program had, because again, the Constellation architecture was in large part driven by shuttle capabilities. You had the solid rocket motors, you had expertise from the tank, had some application coming over, and then a lot of generic capabilities in terms of workforce and property and facilities that exploration needed from shuttle. So there was never a complete 100% alignment with that. Sometimes shuttle still needed something, and exploration was like, well, we would like it at a certain time frame. So it was that kind of disconnect. And so the big issues that came up in sort of the 2005 to 2009 time period between shuttle and between exploration, which is where I would get involved, were these resolving discrepancies between different schedules. And there were a number of examples. There was vacating floor space, manufacturing space at MAF. There was timing of releasing test stand capabilities, the A1, A2 test stands at the Stennis Space Center. And there was a couple property issues as well. All of them were basically disconnects between when the shuttle was ready and willing to release something and when exploration was ready and willing to take it. And then there were some additional dynamics laid on top of that. Again, you had two separate mission directorates with equal leads at the top, so there was no single decision maker. Decisions had to be made through some sort of consensus. There was this buy by the yard dynamic. Exploration was really driving a helpful conversation at the agency level about how we fund capabilities. Traditionally, the Space Shuttle program would tend to fund 100% of the capability it was using, even if it didn't use 100% of the capability. So Shuttle might be in a facility, use 75% of lab time, but paid for 100%. So a lot of the costs that the agency incurred for maintaining capabilities were buried within the shuttle budget. Exploration wanted to drive a discussion about, do we really need this lab to be at this level? Can it get by smaller? We only want to pay for what we need in any particular circumstance. We want to buy it by the yard. And so there was a number of interlocking dynamics going on, but the primary one was the schedule driver between operations and exploration of when certain things would be handed over. One of my key takeaways from this process was it is invaluable to have clear priorities. And from the beginning, right from 2004, there was no question that the agency's priority, SOMD's priority, ESMD's priority was the safe fly-out of the Space Shuttle program. The Columbia accident happened on February 1st, 2003, and within a year and a half, we were already beginning intensive planning for shuttle retirement. That planning activity was given specific direction. Nothing that retirement was doing should in any way interfere with the safe fly-out of the shuttle program. And the great thing about priorities is even if you're last on the priority list, it's better to know that you're at the bottom than to have any ambiguity about where you stand. So throughout the planning stage, there was never any question about where shuttle retirement stood in the great scheme of things. If the program said they needed a capability, there would be some gentle pushback about from some of the retirement planning folks saying, are you sure? Let's document everything out. But it was never more than that, and the emphasis was always on safe flyout. It was that case when the shuttle program had its initial shuttle retirement planning office with its initial board structure separate from the operations board structure. It stayed the same when those structures were combined into a single office. There was never any question from either the leadership in SOMD or ESMD that flyout was the paramount concern. ESMD never pushed hard for getting a capability before the shuttle program was truly ready to relinquish it. So I think the lesson learned there is in any activity, but particularly when you're doing a large program shutdown, make sure you have your priorities straight. And certainly for human spaceflight, that priority was on safe flyout. Another key takeaway was how you estimate the scope of something as large as shuttle retirement. In some sense, retiring a major program is sort of the mirror image of starting up a major program. When you start up a major program, you've got to set up the technical scope, you've got to set up the schedule, you have to do budget estimates, bases of estimate, you have to do contracts, stand up contracts, do contract mods, sole sourcing, you have to handle workforce issues. Do you have the right people on board? Do you have the facilities available? There's a whole range of things you do when you start up a program, particularly one as big as Shuttle, which took up a large part of the agency's footprint. And you just wind that in reverse when you do retirement. You have to shut down contracts. You have to gracefully relinquish people so that you keep them on until you don't need their capabilities. You have to keep an eye on your people so that they have a future, so they're incentivized to continue to perform to the greatest extent possible. You have to vacate floor space. You have to vacate property. So it's kind of in reverse, and there's obviously some differences there, but so when you look at the initial estimates of what it would take to shut down the shuttle program, you have to see it through the prism of people saying, we know what it takes to run this program, so we can only imagine it's going to be a huge effort to shut it down. And in the beginning, 2004 and 5, the initial assumptions made were that the shuttle program would have to create a lot of the processes to back out of this major national capability. We'd have to create a process to get rid of property, create a process to handle workforce transition issues, create a process to vacate facilities, even tear them down if we had to. So your initial estimates assumed all of those things. And when you rack up those assumptions that the program would have to do all of this work from whole cloth, you ended up with a very large estimate. That estimate was very valuable. It set the corner case. It said this is what it would take, assuming we had no help as the Space Shuttle program. And then over the course of the next probably 6 to 7 years was a process through PPBE, that's Program Planning, Budgeting, and Execution, the fancy name for the agency's budget process, of using that budget process to question each of those assumptions, and by questioning those assumptions, slowly whittle down the cost estimate so that it would become, more in line with the core set of stuff the agency really had to do, and the core set of ways the agency would do it. So, for example, we assumed that the shuttle program would have to set up a process to disposition property, take property we no longer needed and get rid of it somehow, safe it, demill it, the whole bit. Then we realized that there were other parts of both the agency and the federal government through the General Services Administration who had expertise in doing that. We didn't have to create processes whole cloth. So it increased our integration challenges because we had to talk to people we normally don't talk to for the execution of operations. But through that, we were able to attack one of the fundamental assumptions that drove up our initial estimates, which was we'd have to disposition all this property. So the real lesson learned here is it's okay to scope out the entirety of your effort up front and to really put a corner case estimate out there of what do you think it would cost. But in no way should you pretend that that estimate is gospel. That's your starting point. That's the starting point to really in detail lay out your assumptions. And then through your subsequent processes, through subsequent planning, in our case we use the budget process, attack each of those assumptions and really work each of them hard until you get to the absolute core of things that you have to do. So using the budget as a way to attack assumptions was a key lesson learned from us. Our initial estimate for what it would take to shut down the shuttle program was informed by a lot of assumptions. The initial estimate was made in the 2004 timeframe, and it was about $4.5 billion. And that estimate assumed that the Space Shuttle program would have to essentially shut down everything on its own, that it would have to invent all these processes and do it. So obviously that was a large number. That was more than the annual operating budget of the shuttle program. In fact, it was about half again as large as the operating budget of the program. And even as that estimate was being generated, everyone knew that was not the final answer. And so you use the budget process to start attacking it. And I remember one line in particular at a meeting, Bill Gerstenmaier, the AAA for SOMD, said, every dime spent on transition retirement was a dime spent not building new hardware to carry astronauts to the moon and Mars and asteroids, to do the real mission of the agency. The agency's mission was not retirement, and the agency did not get a gold star if retirement was done, with gold plating. Retirement's job was to get out of the shuttle program gracefully, transition the stuff we need to new programs, and then start doing those new programs. So if that's the guiding philosophy, we take that $4.5 billion initial estimate, we start attacking the assumptions. Do we have to do this? We treat this property like it's flight hardware when it's no longer, it's excess property. And eventually, by the time we got to actually executing retirement after the last flight, STS-135, in July of 2011, we had gone down to the neighborhood of about $450 to $500 million to do the core work of accessing property, getting out of facilities, recordation, IT, software, and all the other things we had to do. And then there was another bill that we had to pay for of about $500 million for pension based on the specifics of our contract with United Space Alliance. So we went from an original $4.5 billion estimate down to $500 million to $1 billion, depending on how you count pension. And so that really demonstrated the fact that it came down to questioning assumptions through our budget process. When you talk about shutting down a major program, a natural question is, when do you start planning it? There are some requirements, NASA requirements, to do decommission planning very early on in the program design process. Now, most of our program documentation, our 7120s and 7123s, are in large part geared towards science programs where there's a definite start, you build a spacecraft, and then there's a launch and operations phase, then a science phase, and eventually an end. So it's a nice, neat box. The Shuttle is not like that. Shuttle is more like a facility for NASA than it is a mission. It's a capability that continues on with an indefinite future, which is fine. It's just different than some of the other projects that NASA does. So you can talk about, when you do a spacecraft, what is your decommissioning plan? Are you going to send Galileo into Jupiter so that the RTGs don't impact Europa? Are you going to continue to fund research and analysis afterwards? Where are you going to budget that? What are you going to do with the little bit of property and manufacturing tooling that's left on the ground? Because you know you're going to get there within about a decade or so, or however long after you launch. Shuttle, it's different. Our replacement systems, Space Launch System and Orion, are different because we don't have any definite end date. So there's some work at the beginning that we can naturally do. We can have a general understanding of whether our property has an alternate use for other programs or whether it's going to be exclusive to us. We can have an understanding about what kind of facilities we have and whether we're going to be in a facility full-time, half-time, whatever. But it is probably not very advantageous to start talking about how we're going to specifically retire something like the Space Launch System when I don't know when it's going to happen and I don't know what retirement means. What do you tell people in 1972 when Shuttle is approved, or 1981 when it first flies, what their assumptions are on retirement? You'd spend a lot of time spinning your wheels and you don't get much out of it. So it is possible to start planning, really in-depth planning of a program too early. Even in as late as 2004, you have to sort of frame your discussion about how you're going to plan for retirement very carefully, because you do have to start up intensive planning at that point. You're told that you are going to retire within 6 years, 7 as it turned out. And so you've got a $3 billion a year program. You have to figure that out. But your planning has to coordinate very tightly with your execution. So there's probably a time frame in which you're planning, but at some point you got to cut the cord and start executing. And the risk is that if your planning activity runs too long without making major execution decisions on that planning, that you're spinning your wheels again. So the more tightly you could couple your planning with your execution, you can link your planning to these things that are going to start happening immediately, that's going to probably be successful. So I've heard anything from do intensive planning right at the beginning of your program to you really shouldn't plan until you're only about 2 or 3 years out. I think the reality is probably a little bit, 4 or 5 years. It took us 5 years to get a good solid TNR estimate. We probably could have cut that down a little bit, but you need to plan up front, but you got to realize your initial plan doesn't survive the first 5 minutes of battle. Another lesson learned is the relationship across all levels of an organization when you're doing something as important as retiring a national asset like Shuttle is absolutely vital. We had benefited in the Space Shuttle program from having been around for 30, 35 years. And so there was a very clear understanding on what the program did and what headquarters did. And the balance of what a program or a headquarters does for any particular program is going to change depending on what that particular program is. But in the case of Shuttle, it was clear that the program was focused on operations, and this was its scope of effort. It had the authority to do this, the authority to make technical budget and schedule decisions. And headquarters had the authority to investigate those decisions and to be responsible for up and out communication, to do general budget management and schedule management. So the roles and responsibilities were very clear for operations. We benefited from that in retirement because we could leverage off of that multi-decade relationship between a program and headquarters. It wasn't always roses and butterflies, and it wasn't always smooth sailing, but it had 30 years of runtime on it, which was very valuable. So when I came on board, I was very interested in not reinventing the wheel. I wanted to leverage off of that experience. So when the shuttle program identified people who were focused on retirement, my first goal was to make sure that I was in sync with those people. There was never any surprises. If headquarters was thinking something slightly different than what I thought the program was thinking, I made sure my folks knew about that down the program, and vice versa. Again, there's a limit to what pre-planning can do. The plan is nothing. The planning is everything. When you come to execution, it comes down to the people and the relationships those people have and the expertise that they have. So it was absolutely invaluable that headquarters and the program stayed not totally synced up. There was always going to be some, differences on some minor issues, but as long as people were talking and respected the position of the other, that was absolutely vital. So I think the relationship between headquarters and the program for TNR was pretty strong. The Space Shuttle program had a long-standing risk management system. It was an operational program flying humans into space, so risk management was at the core of what the program did. And I wasn't around for a large part of the program's history, but I understood there was a lot of evolution in how the program handled risks. So by the time I came on board and started dealing with retirement issues, we had the benefit of being able to leverage off of an existing program risk management system. The program would track retirement-specific risks. They'd track risks on workforce and availability of facilities and so forth. And they would bake that into their risk management system, and it would be treated like any other program risk. So because you had a new family of risks, these retirement risks, there was some startup transients and how you incorporate those into the system, but you had a system there that was able to take them in and start developing mitigation plans and what have you. As a uniqueness of our Space Ops Mission Directorate at headquarters, we did not have a directorate-wide risk management system. However, our AA had been a deputy in the shuttle program and managed the station program, so he was well-versed in risk management. So we didn't have a directorate risk management system. Rather, the way we handled risks was twofold. One, we handled risks through the budget process. There were threats and liens against the budget for things that might happen, and those threats and liens, numbers, and details came out of the program's risk management system. Again, they had a way to do that. And then there were integration type of risks, which Gerst had to manage between his operations directorate and the development directorate in ESMD. And those risks were managed through a series of control boards that both Gerst and ESMD managed, the Transition Control Board and the Joint Integration Control Board. So risk management there was handled, 1, through control boards and actions there, 2, through the budget process, 3, there was always pop-up things which came up, and 4, ESMD stood up a risk management system because the way they were doing business, it made sense. And so TNR was able to leverage off of that system a little bit too, particularly in the later planning years, 2006, 7, 8, so forth. We were able to identify risks and start massaging them a little bit there. That worked. I think we were able to, we successfully flew out the program, and we brought TNR in under schedule and under budget, so that's a good thing. The challenge with a risk management system is how far do you take it? You always need one. It's simply a matter of the details of what kind you want to set up. So I think in hindsight, the program did excellent at risk management. Headquarters did pretty good at risk management. Maybe we could have used a little more formality there, but at the same time, formality carries costs. So I guess the lesson learned, my takeaway from that is acknowledge that you should handle risks whenever you start a new activity like retirement, and give some thought as to what that risk management system should look like for you. The answer is you need some sort of system to manage risks. The issue is just what kind of details you're going to use to set it up, but make sure you think deeply about it. One of the unexpected things for me was not so much unexpected, but it was different than what the program had to deal with historically, was we had to cultivate relationships with organizations and individuals outside of the Space Shuttle program that the program didn't have to deal with during operations. Now, first, let's set up the scope here. The Space Shuttle program in operations was a worldwide program. We had communications assets in Spain and Australia. We had TAL site, transatlantic abort landing site agreements with a whole host of countries throughout the program's history. At the end, it was with Spain and France. We had emergency landing site agreements with, there were dozens around the world. We interfaced with Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, Homeland Security, the states. In operations, when the shuttle mission was flying, there were lots of organizations that we all had to balance and make sure everyone was on the same page. So it wasn't unusual for the shuttle program to have to interface with a lot of organizations outside of the program itself. What changed for shuttle retirement was which organizations we had to interface with, and to some extent how those relationships changed over time. So for retirement, the issues became, how do you get rid of property? How do you vacate international sites that you had occupied as an emergency landing site and that you had equipment there for? How do you deal with state historic preservation officers who have a mandate to be curators for assets within their state boundaries and to make sure those assets are handled in a historically sensitive fashion? How do you handle relationships with the National Park Service, with the General Services Administration who dispositions property, with companies as those companies are doing WARN Act notices notifying employees that they're being let go? So we had changes over time in the way that we interacted with organizations. We had different organizations we interacted with, and those that we had traditionally interacted with, like DOD and Department of State, the nature of those interactions changed during retirement. And so you had to cultivate a whole new set of relationships. Earlier on, I said that we had an initial budget estimate of $4.5 billion to shut down the program. We managed to get that down by an order of magnitude. In part, that was through cultivating relationships with people who knew how to do things that we needed to do for retirement, who knew how to get rid of property, how to vacate buildings, how to do records management, how to do historic preservation, how to do IT archiving. So we developed relationships with organizations that the shuttle program didn't traditionally have to go out to. Any program, particularly one as big as this, is going to have the same issue. You can't assume that you're going to have only the relationships that you've had with the people you've had relationships with before, and that those relationships will stay the same as you ramp down, because there's going to be externalities and other factors there. We had issues coming up from state offices who, it turns out, could have veto and mandate power over the shuttle program, saying you have to do this or that to maintain this facility or this piece of property. We had interactions with schools in ways we hadn't had before, and universities and museums to hand out property as artifacts. These were all very new to us. We had new relationships at headquarters, relationships with our property disposal folks. Now, the shuttle program was getting rid of property all the time as part of a normal operational rhythm. But the large-scale disposition of unique property was something that required a whole new level of planning. So we interfaced a lot with the Mission Support Directorate here, particularly the Office of Strategic Investments. Olga Dominguez ran that, and particularly Sue Kinney and Bob Sharaus and Mike Eaton and Mike Showers and a whole host of folks there on just property disposition. We did the same for facilities, for recordation, for IT. We really had to cultivate new relationships because we were doing a new kind of business, retirement, which was different than ops. So a lesson learned from this experience is make sure you do a conscious inventory of those organizations and relationships you have, and then think deeply about how those will change and what new relationships you will need to cultivate. Don't assume that what worked for you in the past is going to work for you under a new circumstance. My top 3 takeaways from transition retirements. I've had some time to think about it, and I think you can summarize it as planning processes and people. First, planning. You really do have to do some intensive planning whenever you're going to do a new kind of business. In our case, the business of shutting down a program like the Space Shuttle. And so you have to really think through methodically about what that means. Okay, I have to cover the following areas. I have to cover property, real estate, and workforce, and so forth and so on. So you have to lay out all those issues you have to deal with. You're going to have to set up a process by which you think you're going to handle and refine your initial set of assumptions, because the first plan you have is not going to be the one you execute to. Planning is an iterative thing. At least it should be. If planning is done right, it's iterative. I forgot who said it once, but there was a quote I like. The plan is nothing, planning is everything. And if you consider the plan as always something that is subject to change, but you have a strong process for amending that plan, that's a cornerstone of success. Related to that, number 2 is processes. You have a plan in place that's been developed and that hopefully is thorough and has been given a lot of due consideration. Now, what's your process for amending that plan? Because you will have to make amendments. Things are going to happen. Unanticipated consequences, your refinements and estimates are going to change. What are the processes you're going to leverage to make continual adjustments to your plan? Do you have to have rigorous documentation of those processes? Can they be handled more informally? That's going to change depending on the circumstance. Who do you have to interact with? Whose approval or consensus do you have to gather to make changes to that plan? How are you going to gather that consensus? So you have to think through your processes. NASA is very good about change management and change control. Systems engineering is really in our blood, and systems engineering is at its heart about change management. But when you do something as fundamentally novel as shutting down the shuttle program, you got to think through your processes and understand the processes themselves will change over time as the whole system evolves. And the third is people. People are they're not the glue that tie it together. They're the brick and the mortar and everything else. People make the processes and the planning work. For shuttle retirement, you had a lot of experienced people. That was a great benefit of the program. You had a program that had cultivated people's expertise over 30 years of operations. These people knew how to fly shuttles. They knew every bolt on this system. And if they didn't, they sure as heck knew someone who did. So these were experts, world experts in flying space hardware. There were no better people. Now we were asking them to take their life's work and shut it down. And that's a jarring thing. It's emotionally jarring, but even from a work execution standpoint, it can be jarring. You're used to treating a piece of hardware that's going to fly into space very delicately. You're used to documenting it. You're used to certain procedures to make sure that when it got on orbit, after spending millions, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars getting there, it's going to do what it's intended to do. Now we were telling people that is no more than what it will end up in a museum as a display object to teach future generations on how the space program works. You treat a museum artifact very differently than a piece of flight hardware, but the same people were processing both. And so we were asking them to make a major change in how they thought about how things should work. And then, as I said earlier, we had to cultivate relationships with organizations that we didn't have to deal with prior. So we had 30 years of relationships with the 45th Space Wing at Kennedy Space Center. But we didn't have many relationships with the California State Historic Preservation Officer. So in addition to asking people within the program to change their mindset about how they treat their processes, which made them successful for 30 years, you're now asking them to also interface with organizations which they historically haven't had to interface with and which carry their own priorities and perspectives and processes and history with them. State Historic Preservation Officers, National Park Service, National Records Archives, the Smithsonian. Each of these other groups have their own culture, way of looking at things that is unique to that has made those organizations successful. But it's a different culture than ours. And now within a relatively short period of time, we have to meld these organizations into a functioning team. And we have to do so under, while we're still operating the program, because we're doing this alongside. It's very challenging. And one of the most profound things I heard throughout the shuttle retirement process is lesson number 1 is assume positive intent. Assume that everyone on that team, while their perspective may be different than yours, is ultimately committed to the success of the entire endeavor. When you're in a knockdown, drag-out fight with someone over an issue which you feel passionately about, and which obviously this person on the other side of the table feels passionately about, it's very easy to forget that they are as interested in success as you are. They just have a different take on success. You have to step back and really make a conscious effort to put yourself in their shoes. Assume positive intent. Assume everyone wants to be successful. If everyone comes in with that attitude, it's going to be hard. There's just too much change shutting down a program this big to expect it to be easy. People are going to come in with different perspectives. I got frustrated a lot when an issue that wasn't even on my radar the week prior suddenly was the most important thing I had to deal with that week. And I had no idea. It could be an accounting issue. It could be a question from the Park Service wanting a piece of documentation but not paying for it. Whole host of things. But you step back and say, assume positive intent. Then you talk to the right people. You find out your information. You don't make hasty judgments. You don't fly off the handle. Take a deep breath. You do everything you can to understand the issue in front of you, and then you execute. Because again, this is a dynamic environment here, and you've got a plan that's constantly being updated through a series of processes that you've hopefully given a lot of thought to, but which themselves will evolve over time. And then you've got a team of people that will be rather large, and the team itself will have people coming in and out, and you've got to meld all that together and make it into a team. And I think if you start from the proposition that everyone is committed to the success of the team, that's issue number one. And issue number two is I'm going to understand something before we move out. I have at least found in this process, in this endeavor, that was some measure of success.